You're watching Coronavirus in Context. I'm Dr. John Whyte, Chief Medical Officer at WebMD. Have your vacation plans changed at all this summer? Are you thinking about going to a hotel? What about an Airbnb? To answer some of your travel questions, I've asked Chris Lehane. He's the Senior Vice President of Policy and Communications at Airbnb. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Dr. Whyte, it's an honor and pleasure, and really thank you and WebMD for all the stuff that you've been doing. I mean, it's amazing to see how many people are going to the site and the source to be able to make smart decisions about their lives. So really appreciate you and really all the doctors and frontline responders out there. I mean, just incredible what you've been doing. So we're grateful.
Well, people are searching a lot about travel on, WebMD and folders. And let's start off with, you and I were chatting right before we came on. You're at an Airbnb today.
Yeah.
Are Airbnbs safer than going to a hotel?
People sort of understand that inherently, if you're having to choose an accommodation to go to, people want to travel. They've been pent up. Traveling is innate to humans. By the way, there's a whole separate conversation on the health aspects of making sure you're connecting and not lonely, all of those pieces. Yeah. But they understand that when you get an Airbnb, you're getting a whole home. There's not the shared common spaces. You can get your own pool. You can be by a lake, at a beach. That this is really people who are typically driving within 300 miles of where they live. That's almost 60% of the travel. What I think is really going on is that people do understand, that Airbnbs themselves are inherently a safer travel option because you can drive there, have access to your own home, multiple bedrooms, your own kitchen, your own pool. And then on top of that, we were one of the first players in the travel and tourism sector that put in place an enhanced cleaning protocol.
Well, let's talk about
Sure.
Those safety measures, and let's be very practical because sometimes we use these terms that most viewers.
Yes, no one talks that way. Yes.
Yeah, I recognize. So break it down for us.
Yeah.
What are those safety measures that you're all doing, and also how do you police that? Because it's somewhat decentralized as well, isn't it, as a process? So how do you know that folks actually are doing what you're saying you're requiring them to do? So let's start off with, what are those enhanced, words we use? What are those cleaning methods?
I'll try to do these in real people terms, like the terms that you would use if you're talking with your family. First of all, I'll just qualify it by also say that, we really developed this in consultation with Dr. Vivek Murthy, who I'm sure you're aware of. But
former Surgeon General.
Right, yeah. Former Surgeon General of the United States. Obviously got input from the CDC and other really leading public health experts out there. So it was really informed by the best science and advice that we could get. But it basically breaks down into 5 elements. And again, I'll try to do this in real people language. The first is just making sure that, whether you yourself are cleaning it or you have someone coming in to clean for you, that they have the right protective gear and also access to the right type of chemicals and cleaning products. Obviously, those have become more important than ever before. Then when you get to the actual clean, there's sort of 2 additional steps. So step 2 is what people have historically called cleaning often meant getting rid of clutter and dust. That still takes place. But then you get to a step 3, which is the sanitizing piece of this and making sure that people understand how you should be wiping the surfaces, making sure you're applying the chemicals that have been recommended so that you're getting the right chemicals on the right surfaces. Obviously, that is to take as many steps as you can to deal with the virus aspect of this. Then you get to step 4, which is we call the reset. Change the materials that you're using, change your gloves, change your mask, and then make sure that as you restock the particular listing, the toilet paper, stuff that may be in the refrigerator, stuff that may be paper products, that you are using new equipment when you do that to make sure that nothing is getting passed on. And then the final stage that we recommend, and this is a little bit different depending on where you are in the world because we've gotten different inputs from the leading public health experts in those particular countries, but I'll use the US. Here in the US, it's recommended that there's a 24-hour timeline or time frame between when the last person, that cleaner, leaves the premises and when the guest arrives. And the reason for that, and you know this as a doctor, but the aerosol element tends to disintegrate and degrade the longer the time period is between when someone has been in there and when a new person enters. Now, different advice on what that should be in different parts of the world. 24 hours tends to be a little bit on the longer side, and that's what the CDC has looked at. And so that's what we have certainly recommended here in the US. And then you had a second question, which is incredibly important as well, which is how do you make sure this is happening? And there's a couple of different ways that we do that. First of all, we do require hosts to attest that they are doing this. And that attestation, if they don't live up to it, can lead to a removal of that particular host. Guests, in turn, can rate the host in terms of whether they felt it was safe and clean. So that's a little bit of I'm going to get into a little tech speak. I hope you'll bear with me for a second. But we are a two-sided platform. Hosts only do well if guests do well. Guests only do well if hosts invite them into their homes. And so the way the platform has always historically worked is that there is a natural alignment of interest. For hosts to continue to get business, they do want to deliver on being clean, in this case, healthy and clean. And those guests have an interest to make sure that they're rating these places pretty rigorously so that the whole community can benefit from that.
Do you have advice for guests, or there's something that we should be doing on the day we check in to the Airbnb?
Yeah, so what I typically advise, and this is what I certainly do. I'm in an Airbnb, right now. I'm traveling with my wife and 2 teenage boys.
Okay.
I tend to check in to make sure that there's the time period that I'm comfortable with in terms
now,
of.
Do they know your job before you check in?
They do not. I try. We have this phrase, and I hope you'll bear with me on this one. Try your own dog food, right? That probably sounded a little bit better pre-pandemic than it does when you're in the pandemic. But the point is, you really want to test the product as a typical consumer would use it, so you experience it that way. So I often, I'm going to let a little bit of a secret here. I often have my better half, my wife, do the booking, so people can't necessarily figure out who it is. And I will say that my 2 teenage boys are very rigorous in terms of the review process. But to your question, we will, often just ask a couple questions, because the questions are a good way to, just test whether that host is taking it really rigorously or not. I'll often ask, when was the cleaner in and when was the last time, so you get a sense of that time difference. Walk around the place when we arrive to make sure you're doing a spot check. Look, I've heard of guests, and we don't do this, by the way, but I know a lot of hosts provide this, and some guests have asked for it. Can you leave cleaning products there? Because, I may want to touch it up myself, particularly areas that you may be, especially sensitive about. Now, I think personally that's going a little bit above and beyond, but it's ultimately whatever makes you comfortable. The thing that we always counsel people is, and this is an obvious point, but it's certainly it bears worth repeating, prioritize your health and safety. We were one of the first platforms that, when the WHO declared a global pandemic, immediately just said, everyone can get a full refund. Don't put, money ahead of your safety. And interestingly, I think we built up an element of trust with the guests. I think one of the reasons we've bounced back in the way we have, we've seen a 20% increase in trust levels on Airbnb, because I think there was a sense that we were trying to look out for those guests. That's not why we did it. It was just the right thing to do, period. But I do think that speaks a little bit to the values of our hosts and our community. Amongst the things that we've worked on, and I think you're aware of this, is we've created housing for over, I think, 100,000 frontline responders to be able to stay in Airbnb listings near where they are serving all of us. Those are our hosts opening up their homes for free. And interestingly, the cleaning protocols that I walked you through really were a derivative of that program, right? When we put that in place back in March, we needed a way to be able to make sure that when those frontline responders got there, it was clean, and when they left, it would be adequately cleaned. And so these protocols that we developed, that now we're applying, across the globe, are really developed to help support that frontline program.
Take out your crystal ball, Chris, and tell us, what does travel look like 6 months from now and a year from now?
I think it's going to look an awful lot like the travel that, at least I'll speak for myself, I'm a little bit older, that I had growing up, which is you got in your family car, you drove a couple hours, maybe you met your grandparents or your cousins, and you were by a lake, or by a beach, or going to a national park. That's what we're seeing, right now. happening. And I think, look, the pandemic is awful at every level. I'm not trying to gloss over this. You know, that throwback type of a vacation and time with your family is, I think there's a lot of great things to be said for that. You know, families spending time together, driving over hill and dale, going to local communities that are in their backyards. It's awesome. We did Yellowstone, right? It's a really cool way to spend time with your family. I think 6 months out, let's call it, you know, post-vaccine, and post-acceptance of people taking the vaccine, which has to happen, obviously, as well. I think you'll start to get cross-border travel coming back at that point. But even then, I do think that the pandemic is going to have accelerated trends that we were seeing earlier, which is local, authentic, unique type of travel. And I do think, you know, people always talk about the new, that presumes that there's a norm that people are building off of. I do think, to the extent there was one, there was a trend that was already happening that will get accelerated. I think people will be a lot more interested in going to rural places. I think there'll, in effect, be a democratizing of travel, with the money being spread out a little bit differently and a little bit more. Like, a lot of terrible things are coming out of this pandemic. Typically, when you have a global disruption of any kind, you know, a big challenge for all of humans are, you know, are we able to come together and create some positives and goods out of that? And I think within the travel sector, it will be that democratizing of travel, moving away from mass travel to a more localized, authentic, in the same way that, you know, you move from sometimes, you know, mass food to a healthier way that people think about food. I think you'll have a version of that, or an analog to that will happen in travel.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you for sharing your insights, sharing your tips on, you know, how we can stay safe when we travel, and we'll check in with you in 6 months and see if your predictions have come to fruition.
Dr. Whyte, thank you. And really, you know I said this earlier, but I want to emphasize, A, everyone stay safe out there, prioritize health and safety over anything else. And B, thank you for everything that you guys do to help us. I mean, the amount of information people are able to access is incredible. And, you know, you're saving lives. So thank you.